Jake Morrison stood in the doorway of his farmhouse kitchen, staring at the empty coffee pot with hollow eyes. The clock on the wall read 4:30 a.m., but he hadn't slept more than 2 hours in the past 3 days. Behind him, the soft crying of his newborn twins echoed from the bedroom, a sound that had become both his greatest joy and his deepest source of panic. 6 weeks had passed since Sarah died during childbirth. 6 weeks since his world collapsed into a nightmare of dirty diapers, empty formula cans, and sleepless nights. The ranch that had once been his pride now felt like a burden too heavy to carry. Cattle wandered unfenced pastures, broken equipment sat rusting in the yard, and bills piled up on the kitchen table like autumn leaves. Jake rubbed his unshaven face and walked back toward the bedroom. Emma and Ethan lay in their makeshift cribs, 2 wooden boxes lined with blankets that Sarah had sewn during her pregnancy. She had been so excited about becoming a mother. She had painted the nursery yellow, not wanting to know the baby's gender ahead of time. She had folded and refolded tiny clothes, humming lullabies while she worked. Now those same yellow walls felt like they were closing in on him. Emma's cries grew louder, and Jake picked her up, cradling her against his chest. She was so small, so fragile. Her tiny fingers gripped his shirt as she searched for comfort he didn't know how to provide. Ethan stirred in his box, making the soft, whimpering sounds that meant he would be awake and hungry soon, too. Jake looked at the nearly empty can of formula on the dresser. Maybe enough for 2 more bottles. After that, he didn't know what he would do. The bank account was almost empty, and his last trip to town had been a disaster. He'd left the babies with his neighbor, old Mrs. Patterson, for 3 hours while he tried to sell some cattle. But the prices were terrible, and the buyers sensed his desperation. They offered him half what the animals were worth. On the drive home, his truck had started making a grinding noise that meant expensive repairs he couldn't afford. Mrs. Patterson had looked overwhelmed when he picked up the twins, and he could tell she was too old and tired to help him again any time soon. She had raised 8 children of her own, but that was 40 years ago. The sun began to rise over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Jake walked to the window, still holding Emma, and looked out at his land. 500 acres of prime grazing land that had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had built the original cabin with his own hands. His father had expanded it into the house where Jake now stood, where Jake and Sarah had planned to raise their children. Sarah. The thought of her still hit him like a physical blow. She had been so strong, so full of life. She could rope a steer as well as any man and bake a apple pie that won first place at the county fair every year. She had been excited about the twins, talking endlessly about all the things they would do together. Family camping trips, teaching them to ride horses, showing them every inch of the ranch that would one day be theirs. Instead, she had died before she could even hold them properly. The doctor said it was an amniotic embolism, something that happened so fast there was nothing anyone could do. One minute she was laughing about Ethan being born first, making him the older brother by 3 minutes. The next minute, she was gone. Jake had been in such shock that the next few days were a blur. Funeral arrangements, well-meaning neighbors bringing casseroles he couldn't eat, relatives flying in from distant states to pay their respects. His brother Tom had come from Denver and stayed a week, helping with the babies and the ranch work. But Tom had his own family and his own job. He couldn't stay forever. "You should think about selling," Tom had said on his last day. "Move closer to town where you can get help. These babies need stability, Jake. They need a mother." The words had stung because Jake knew they were probably true. But selling the ranch felt like betraying everything his family had built. This was supposed to be Emma and Ethan's inheritance, their connection to their mother and their heritage. How could he take that away from them before they were old enough to understand what it meant? Emma finally stopped crying and fell asleep against his chest. Jake lowered her back into her makeshift crib and picked up Ethan, who was starting to fuss. The baby's face was red and scrunched up, his tiny fists waving in the air. He looked so much like Sarah when she was frustrated about something. The same determined expression, the same stubborn set to his jaw. Jake heated the last bottle of formula and fed Ethan while walking around the bedroom. Through the thin walls, he could hear the wind picking up outside. November in Montana could be brutal, and he still needed to fix the loose boards on the barn roof before the first snow. The fence in the south pasture was down in 3 places, and half his cattle were wandering onto the neighbor's land. Mr. Henderson had been patient so far, but Jake knew that patience was wearing thin. Henderson was a good man, but he ran a tight operation and couldn't have Morrison cattle eating his grass and drinking his water indefinitely. Jake needed to fix those fences, but fence posts cost money he didn't have. So did the tools to properly repair them. Ethan finished his bottle and burped against Jake's shoulder. The baby's eyes were heavy, and Jake could tell he was ready to sleep again. The twins seemed to take turns demanding attention, which meant Jake never got more than an hour of rest at a time. He was starting to make mistakes, forgetting to turn off the stove, leaving gates open, putting dirty diapers in the refrigerator instead of the trash. Yesterday, he had fallen asleep standing up while brushing his horse. Lucky for him, Ranger was an old, gentle gelding who just stood patiently until Jake woke up and realized what had happened. But what if it had been one of the younger horses? What if he had been holding one of the babies? Jake put Ethan back in his crib and sat down heavily in the rocking chair Sarah had insisted they buy. She had found it at an antique store in town and had spent hours refinishing it, painting it white with tiny pink and blue flowers along the arms. She had planned to nurse the babies in this chair to rock them to sleep every night. Now Jake used it to collapse in exhaustion, staring at his children and wondering if he was failing them completely. The sound of a truck coming up the driveway made him look toward the window. It was too early for visitors, and he wasn't expecting anyone. Maybe it was Henderson, coming to complain about the cattle again. Or maybe it was someone from the bank, coming to discuss the mortgage payments he was already behind on. Jake looked down at his clothes. Same shirt he'd been wearing for 3 days, stained with baby formula and Lord knows what else. His jeans were dirty from the ranch work he'd tried to do between feeding schedules. He probably smelled like he looked, but there was no time to change now. The truck was already pulling up to the house. He glanced back at the sleeping twins, then walked to the front door. Through the window, he could see an old blue pickup truck, rusty around the edges but well-maintained. He didn't recognize it, which was unusual in this part of Montana, where everyone knew everyone else's vehicles. The truck door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was probably in her 50s, with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore faded jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt under a heavy jacket. Everything about her said she was used to hard work and outdoor life. Jake opened the door before she could knock, not wanting any loud sounds to wake the babies. The woman looked up at him with kind but serious brown eyes. She had the weathered face of someone who had spent most of her life outdoors, but her expression was warm and concerned. "You Jake Morrison?" she asked. Jake nodded, suddenly aware of how he must look. "Yes, ma'am. Can I help you?" "I'm Margaret Sullivan. Most folks call me Maggie." She looked past him toward the house, and Jake could tell she was taking in the details. The unwashed dishes visible through the kitchen door, the laundry basket full of baby clothes on the porch, the general air of chaos that had become his normal life. "I heard about your situation," she continued, "about your wife and the babies. I'm sorry for your loss." Jake felt his throat tighten. He still couldn't handle condolences without wanting to break down completely. "Thank you. But if you're here about the cattle on Henderson's land, I'm working on getting them back. I just need a few more days to fix the fence." Maggie shook her head. "I'm not here about cattle. I'm here about you and those babies. When's the last time you had a decent meal? Or more than 2 hours of sleep?" The questions hit too close to home. Jake found himself looking at his boots instead of meeting her eyes. "We're managing fine." "I'm sure you are." Her tone was gentle but skeptical. "Mind if I come in? I brought some supplies that might help." Jake hesitated. He didn't know this woman, and he wasn't in the habit of letting strangers into his house, but something about her manner seemed trustworthy, and the word supplies caught his attention. If she had baby formula or diapers, he couldn't afford to turn her away because of pride. "I suppose that would be all right," he said, stepping back from the door. Maggie walked past him into the house, and Jake noticed she moved with the confident stride of someone used to taking charge of situations. She looked around the living room, taking in the baby bottles drying on towels, the pile of burp cloths on the couch, the general disorder that came with caring for twins while trying to run a ranch alone. "Where are the little ones?" she asked. "Sleeping," Jake said quickly. "Finally. They were up most of the night." "Babies do that," Maggie said matter-of-factly. "Especially twins. They seem to have a system worked out where one sleeps while the other demands attention, keeps parents on their toes." Jake looked at her with surprise. "You know about twins?" "I raised 4 sets of them." Jake stared at her. "4 sets? You had 8 children?" Maggie laughed, a warm sound that seemed to lighten the heavy atmosphere in the house. "Lord, no. I had 3 of my own, but I've been a midwife and child care provider for 40 years. Helped deliver more babies than I can count, and cared for plenty more, including several sets of twins whose parents needed extra help." She walked toward her truck and returned with a large canvas bag. "I brought formula, diapers, and some other things you might need. Also made some meals that just need heating up. Figured you might not be getting much time to cook." Jake felt something break loose inside his chest. Relief, gratitude, exhaustion, all mixed together into an emotion too complex to name. "I don't understand. Why would you do this? I don't even know you." Maggie set the bag down and looked at him directly. "Because 43 years ago, I was in a situation something like yours. My husband died when my youngest was 6 weeks old. I had 3 children under the age of 5, no money, and no idea how I was going to manage. A woman I'd never met before showed up at my door with food and offered to help. She saved my life and my children's lives." She paused, her eyes softening with memory. "She told me that someday, when I was able, I should pass it on to someone else who needed help. I've been doing that ever since. When I heard about your situation, I knew it was time to make the drive over here." Jake felt tears threaten, something that happened too easily these days. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything, just let me help." She gestured toward the bedroom where the twins were sleeping. "When did they last eat?" "About an hour ago. They'll probably be hungry again in another hour or 2. "Good. That gives us time to get you some real food and maybe clean up a little." She looked around the kitchen, which Jake suddenly realized looked like a disaster zone. Dirty dishes covered every available surface. Empty formula cans overflowed from the trash, and something that might have been food was growing mold on the counter. "When's the last time you ate something besides coffee and whatever you could grab with one hand?" Maggie asked. Jake tried to remember. He'd had half a sandwich yesterday morning, maybe. Or was that the day before? Time had become meaningless in the constant cycle of feeding, changing, and trying to snatch moments of sleep. "I'm not really hungry," he said, which was true. He seemed to have lost his appetite completely since Sarah died. "Well, too bad," Maggie said briskly, "because I made beef stew, and it's going to waste if someone doesn't eat it. And I hate wasting food." She pulled containers from her bag and began bustling around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had dealt with overwhelmed parents many times before. Jake found himself sitting at his own kitchen table, watching this stranger organize his life with a competence that made him feel both grateful and completely useless. Within minutes, the smell of heating stew filled the kitchen. Maggie had cleared enough counter space to work, loaded the dishwasher, and wiped down surfaces that Jake hadn't realized were dirty. She moved like she knew exactly what needed to be done and in what order. "You don't have to do this," Jake said weakly. "I know I don't have to," Maggie replied, setting a bowl of steaming stew in front of him along with a piece of homemade bread. "I want to." Big difference. The stew smelled better than anything Jake could remember eating in weeks. His stomach, which had been in a constant knot since Sarah died, suddenly reminded him that he was starving. He took a bite, then another, then found himself eating like he hadn't seen food in days. Maggie sat across from him with her own bowl and ate in companionable silence. Through the bedroom wall, Jake could hear one of the twins stirring, making the soft noises that meant someone would be awake and demanding attention soon. "That'll be the little girl," Maggie said without looking up from her stew. "Girls tend to be more vocal about their needs." Jake stared at her. "How could you possibly know that?" "Experience. Plus, I could hear them both breathing when I walked past the bedroom door. The boy's breathing is deeper, more settled. He'll sleep another 30 minutes at least. The girl's breathing was getting lighter, more restless. She'll be awake in the next 5 minutes." As if summoned by Maggie's prediction, Emma's cry rang out from the bedroom. Jake started to get up, but Maggie waved him back down. "Finish your stew. I'll get her." Before Jake could protest, Maggie had disappeared into the bedroom. He heard her talking softly to Emma, her voice taking on the special tone that people used with babies. Within moments, the crying stopped. Maggie returned to the kitchen, carrying Emma, who was looking around with the alert curiosity that newborns sometimes showed when they weren't hungry or uncomfortable. She had stopped crying completely and seemed content in Maggie's arms. "She just wanted some company," Maggie said, settling back into her chair with Emma cradled against her chest. "Babies can sense when they're alone, even when they're sleeping. Makes them nervous." Jake watched Emma snuggle against this stranger and felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that someone else could soothe his daughter. Jealousy that Maggie seemed to have an instinctive understanding of the babies that he was still struggling to develop, and underneath it all, a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face this alone anymore. Jake finished his stew while watching Maggie hold Emma with the natural ease of someone who had spent decades caring for children. The baby girl seemed completely content. Her tiny hand wrapped around Maggie's finger while she made soft, cooing sounds. "She's beautiful," Maggie said, studying Emma's face. "She has your eyes, but that nose is all her mama's." Jake felt his chest tighten at the mention of Sarah. "Everyone says that. I don't see it yet." "You will," Maggie said with quiet confidence. "Right now you're too tired and too scared to see much of anything clearly. But when you start healing, you'll see all the ways your wife lives on in these babies." Ethan's voice joined Emma's from the bedroom, starting with small whimpers that quickly escalated to full-blown cries. Jake started to get up again, but Maggie was already standing. "I'll get him. You finish eating." She handed Emma to Jake and headed for the bedroom before he could argue. Emma immediately started fussing when she left Jake's arms, her face scrunching up in preparation for crying. Jake felt the familiar panic rising in his chest. This was what happened every time he held one of them. They seemed to sense his uncertainty, his fear that he was doing everything wrong. But this time was different. This time, Emma looked up at him with Sarah's dark blue eyes, and for just a moment, Jake saw what Maggie had been talking about, something in the shape of her eyebrows, the curve of her cheek, Sarah's face, but smaller, softer, newer. "Hey there, little girl," he said softly. "It's just me. I know I'm not as good at this as that lady, but I'm learning." Emma stopped crying and studied his face with the intense concentration that babies sometimes showed, as if she was trying to figure out who this person was and whether he could be trusted. Jake found himself relaxing, his shoulders dropping from the constant tension he'd been carrying. Maggie returned with Ethan, who had also stopped crying and was looking around with bright, alert eyes. "They're both hungry," she announced. "But they're also just social creatures. They like having people around." "I've been wondering if I'm doing something wrong," Jake admitted. "They cry so much when it's just me." "You're not doing anything wrong," Maggie said firmly. "But you're one person trying to do the job that usually takes two. Babies need constant attention, and twins need twice as much. It's not about being good or bad at it. It's about having enough hands and enough energy." She walked to the kitchen counter where she'd set the supplies she brought. "I mixed up some extra formula before I came over. Figured you might be running low." Jake felt heat creep up his neck. "How did you know that?" "Because every new parent runs out of everything faster than they expect, and parents dealing with loss and stress run out even faster because they can't think clearly enough to plan ahead." She said it matter-of-factly, without judgment, like she was describing the weather. They fed the babies together, Maggie handling Ethan while Jake took care of Emma. It was the first time since the twins were born that feeding time didn't feel like a desperate race against crying and chaos. Emma drank her bottle without the usual fussing, and Jake realized that his own calm state was affecting her. "You're a natural at this," Maggie observed, watching Jake burp Emma with practiced motions. "Your instincts are good. You just doubt yourself too much." "Sarah was the one who knew about babies," Jake said. "She read every book, talked to every mother in town. I figured she would handle all the baby stuff, and I'd keep working the ranch." "Plans have a way of changing," Maggie said gently. "The important thing is adapting when they do." After the babies were fed and settled, Maggie looked around the house with the assessing eye of someone making plans. "When's the last time you did laundry?" Jake tried to remember. "There's a load in the washer, I think." "It's been there a while." "How long is a while?" "Maybe 3 days?" Maggie made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been resignation. "Well, it'll need to be washed again then. Show me where you keep the detergent." For the next 2 hours, Jake found himself following Maggie around his own house as she systematically organized the chaos his life had become. She rewashed the moldy clothes, started another load of the baby items that had been piling up, and tackled the mountain of dishes with efficient determination. Jake tried to help, but every time he started to do something, one of the babies would wake up and need attention. Maggie seemed to have an internal radar for when they would stir and always finished whatever task she was working on just in time to handle the next crisis. "How do you do that?" Jake asked after the third time she had perfectly timed finishing the kitchen floor, just as Emma started crying. "Practice," Maggie said, picking up Emma and checking her diaper with one smooth motion. "When you've cared for as many babies as I have, you learn to read their rhythms. This little girl has a 2-hour cycle. She eats, sleeps for 90 minutes, then has about 30 minutes of alert time before she needs something again." Jake stared at her. "You figured that out in one morning?" "Babies are creatures of habit, even tiny ones. They like routine, and they'll establish their own patterns if you pay attention." She changed Emma's diaper with the quick efficiency of long practice. "Your boy has a slightly different rhythm. He sleeps deeper, but for shorter periods. He'll probably be the more easygoing one as he gets older, but he'll also be the one who gets into trouble because he's not afraid of anything. You can tell all that from watching them for a few hours? From watching thousands of them over the years." Maggie settled into the rocking chair with Emma, who immediately calmed down. "Every baby is different, but they all follow certain patterns. The trick is learning to see the patterns instead of just reacting to the chaos." Jake sat down heavily on the couch, feeling more exhausted than he had in days, despite having done less physical work than usual. "I don't know how you do this," I feel like I'm drowning, and you make it look easy." "It's not easy," Maggie said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Raising babies is never easy, and doing it alone is one of the hardest things a person can face, but it's not impossible. You just need help, and you need to stop thinking you have to do everything perfectly all the time." She looked around the now organized living room. "Your house is clean, your babies are fed and healthy, and you're keeping the ranch running well enough that the animals aren't suffering. That's not failing. That's surviving under impossible circumstances." "But I can't keep this up forever," Jake said quietly. "I'm making mistakes. Yesterday I put salt in Emma's bottle instead of sugar. Last week I left a gate open and half the horses got out. Tom thinks I should sell the ranch and move to town. What do you think?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the mountains that had been the backdrop of his entire life. "I think this place is all I have left of my family, all I have to give Emma and Ethan of their heritage. But I also think Tom might be right. Maybe I'm being selfish, trying to keep something I can't handle just because I don't want to let go." "Or maybe," Maggie said carefully, "you just need to find a different way to handle it." Before Jake could ask what she meant, the sound of a truck engine outside caught their attention. Jake looked out the window and saw Henderson's familiar red pickup pulling up the driveway. "That's my neighbor," Jake said, feeling his stomach clench. "He's probably here about the cattle again." Maggie glanced out the window and frowned slightly. "Big man? Gray beard? Looks like he's chewing on something sour?" "You know Bob Henderson." "I know of him. His reputation, anyway." She stood up, still holding Emma. "Why don't you let me talk to him?" Jake shook his head. "This is my problem. I need to handle it." "Jake," Maggie said gently, "when's the last time you had a conversation with someone other than babies? When's the last time you felt like you could think clearly enough to negotiate anything?" Jake realized she was right. He'd been operating on pure survival instinct for so long that he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt mentally sharp enough for any kind of serious discussion. "What would you say to him?" Jake asked. "The truth. That you're dealing with a temporary crisis and working on solutions. That you're a good neighbor who's always been reliable and you just need a little patience while you get back on your feet." Henderson's knock on the door was heavy and impatient. Jake looked at Maggie, who nodded encouragingly, then went to answer it. Bob Henderson stood on the porch, his expression as sour as Maggie had predicted. He was a big man with the kind of presence that filled a room and made other people feel smaller. He'd been successful at everything he'd ever tried, and he had little patience for people who couldn't keep up with his standards. "Jake," Henderson said without preamble, "we need to talk about your cattle." "I know, Bob. I'm working on getting the fence fixed. Just need a few more days." Henderson's eyes traveled past Jake to take in the house behind him, and Jake knew what he was seeing. Despite Maggie's morning of cleaning, the place still looked like someone barely hanging on to control. Henderson's gaze stopped on Maggie, who had appeared in the doorway holding Emma. "Who's this?" Henderson asked bluntly. "Margaret Sullivan," Maggie said before Jake could introduce her. "I'm helping Jake with the babies while he gets caught up on ranch work." Henderson looked her up and down with the assessing stare he usually reserved for livestock he was considering buying. "Don't know you?" "I'm from over near Billings," Maggie said calmly. "I specialize in helping families through difficult transitions." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it made her sound more official than she was. Henderson seemed to buy it, his expression softening slightly. "Well, that's something, I guess." He turned back to Jake. "Point is, I can't have your cattle eating my grass indefinitely. I've got my own herd to think about." "I understand," Jake said. "The fence posts are already ordered. I'll have it fixed by the end of the week." This was also not exactly true. The fence posts were ordered in Jake's head, but he hadn't actually placed the order because he didn't have the money to pay for them. Henderson seemed to sense something off about Jake's answer. "What's it going to cost you?" Jake felt heat creep up his neck. "It's manageable." "That's not what I asked." Henderson's voice took on the edge it got when he thought someone was trying to avoid giving him straight answers. "How much for posts and materials?" "About $800, Jake admitted quietly. Henderson whistled low. "That's a lot of money for someone in your situation." "Jake's situation is temporary," Maggie said smoothly. "He's got several options for covering those costs. The question is just timing and logistics." Jake stared at her, wondering what options she was talking about. He didn't have $800. He didn't have $80. Henderson looked between them, clearly trying to figure out what was really going on. "Look, Jake, I don't want to be the bad guy here. I know you're going through hell, but business is business. If you can't fix that fence by next Friday, I'm going to have to start charging you grazing fees for every head of cattle on my land." "That's fair," Maggie said before Jake could respond. "And I'm sure you'll be reasonable about the rates, considering the circumstances." Henderson looked surprised, like he'd expected more argument. "Well, yes. I'm not looking to bankrupt the man, but I can't provide free pasture indefinitely." "Of course not," Maggie agreed. "Jake understands that. Don't you, Jake?" Jake nodded, though he felt like he was watching this conversation happen to someone else. Maggie seemed to be managing Henderson with the same efficient competence she'd shown with the babies and the housework. After Henderson left, Jake sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "I don't have $800 for fence posts. I don't even have the money for Henderson's grazing fees if he starts charging them." Maggie was quiet for a moment, rocking Emma, who had fallen asleep during the conversation with Henderson. "How much do you owe on the mortgage?" "About $40,000 left. Payments are $300 a month, and I'm already 2 months behind." "What about life insurance? Did Sarah have a policy?" Jake felt his face get hot. "There was a small policy through her work, but I used most of it for the funeral and medical bills. There's about $2,000 left, but I've been saving it for emergencies." "Jake," Maggie said gently, "this is an emergency. But what happens when that's gone? What happens next month when I still can't make the payments? When the truck needs repairs or the babies get sick? That money is all that's standing between us and complete disaster." Maggie was quiet for a while, looking out the window at the ranch that stretched into the distance. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "How much land do you have?" 500 acres, most of it good grazing land." "How much debt besides the mortgage?" "About $15,000 in various bills and loans." "So if you sold the ranch, you'd clear maybe $60,000 or $70,000 after paying off everything?" Jake felt his stomach drop. "Probably something like that." "Why?" "Because there might be another option." Maggie shifted Emma to her other arm. "What if you didn't have to sell the whole ranch?" Jake looked at her blankly. "What do you mean?" "What if you sold part of it, kept the house and maybe 50 acres around it, sold the rest to someone who would lease it back to you for grazing?" The idea hit Jake like a physical blow. "Sell part of my family's land?" "Think about it practically," Maggie said. "You can't work 500 acres by yourself while caring for newborn twins. You don't have the money to hire help or buy the equipment you need. But if you sold, say, 400 acres to the right person, you'd have enough money to pay off all your debts, fix everything that needs fixing, and have a cushion for emergencies." Jake wanted to reject the idea immediately, but something made him stop and really consider it. Who would buy ranch land just to lease it back? Someone who wants to invest in land but doesn't want to run cattle. Someone who understands that the best way to protect land is to keep it in the hands of people who know how to care for it. Maggie paused. Someone like Bob Henderson, for instance. "Henderson?" Jake stared at her. "He already has plenty of land. He also has plenty of money and a good head for business. He knows you're a good rancher when you're not dealing with a crisis. He might be very interested in an arrangement that lets him expand his operation while helping out a neighbor." The idea was so unexpected that Jake couldn't immediately process it. Sell land to Henderson but keep working it? It seemed impossible, but also maybe not completely crazy. "I don't know," Jake said finally. "It feels like giving up everything my family worked for." "No," Maggie said firmly. "Giving up would be selling everything and moving away. This would be adapting to circumstances while keeping the core of what matters most. Your children would still grow up on this ranch. They'd still learn about the land and the work. They'd just inherit 50 acres instead of 500. She stood up and walked to the window, still holding Emma. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't holding on to everything exactly as it was. Sometimes it's finding a new way to preserve what really matters. Jake joined her at the window, looking out at the land that had shaped every day of his life. "I wouldn't even know how to approach Henderson about something like that." "That's what I'm here for," Maggie said quietly. "If you want to explore the idea, I can help you figure out how to present it. I've helped other families navigate similar situations." Jake felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in weeks. Not quite hope, but the possibility of hope. The feeling that maybe there was a path forward that didn't involve losing everything or failing his children. Ethan's cry from the bedroom interrupted his thoughts, and this time Jake went to get his son without hesitation. When he returned to the kitchen with Ethan in his arms, he found Maggie had started preparing another bottle. "How long can you stay?" Jake asked. Maggie smiled, the first truly warm smile he'd seen from her. "How long do you need me?" The next 3 days passed like a dream Jake was afraid to wake up from. Maggie had moved into the guest bedroom temporarily, and for the first time since Sarah died, Jake felt like he could breathe. The babies had settled into a routine that actually made sense. The house stayed clean. Meals appeared on schedule. Most importantly, Jake was getting enough sleep to think clearly about the future. On Wednesday morning, while Maggie fed Ethan and Jake held Emma, she brought up the conversation with Henderson again. "Have you thought more about the land proposal?" she asked. Jake had been thinking about little else. "I want to try it, but I don't know how to bring it up without sounding desperate." "You don't sound desperate. You sound like a businessman exploring options." Maggie switched Ethan to her shoulder for burping. "The key is to present it as an opportunity for Henderson, not as a favor to you." "What kind of opportunity?" "Think about it from his perspective. He's been successful because he knows how to recognize good deals. You're offering him prime grazing land at below market prices in exchange for a guaranteed long-term lease arrangement. He gets to expand his operation without the full cost of buying a complete ranch setup." Jake tried to see it through Henderson's eyes. "But why would he want to lease it back to me instead of just running cattle on it himself?" "Because you know this land better than anyone. You know which pastures are best in which seasons, where the water sources are most reliable, how to manage the grass to keep it healthy. He'd be buying your expertise along with your land." Emma finished her bottle and looked up at Jake with alert, curious eyes. She'd been doing that more often lately, studying faces like she was trying to memorize them. Ethan was the same way, and Jake realized they were starting to recognize him as someone important in their world. "When should I talk to him?" Jake asked. "Today, before you lose your nerve and before he starts charging grazing fees." Maggie stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at Henderson's property in the distance. "I'll watch the babies while you drive over there." Jake felt his stomach clench with nerves. What if he says no? What if he thinks it's a crazy idea? Then you'll know, and you can start exploring other options. But Jake, what if he says yes? An hour later, Jake found himself sitting in Bob Henderson's kitchen, drinking coffee and trying not to fidget with his hat, while Henderson listened to his proposal. Jake had practiced the speech during the drive over, but now that he was actually saying it out loud, it sounded even crazier than he'd feared. Henderson was quiet for a long time after Jake finished talking. He sat back in his chair, staring out the window at his own ranch, and Jake could practically see him working through the numbers in his head. 400 acres, Henderson said finally. For how much? Jake took a deep breath. 150,000. Henderson's eyebrows shot up. That's about half what that land is worth. In exchange for a 50-year lease agreement at below-market rates, Jake added quickly. And I maintain all the infrastructure, handle all the day-to-day management, take responsibility for all the ranch work. Henderson was quiet again, and Jake could feel sweat gathering under his collar despite the cool November air. This had been a mistake. Henderson probably thought he was an idiot for suggesting such an arrangement. What about the house and the land around it? Henderson asked. I keep 50 acres around the house, free and clear. That gives me enough space for a small operation, room for the kids to grow up with horses and some cattle of their own. And if you can't handle the ranch work? If this arrangement doesn't work out? Jake had thought about this question during his sleepless nights. Then I sell you the lease back at fair market value, and you own the land outright. Henderson stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the Morrison Ranch visible in the distance. Jake could see his own house from here. Could see the barn that needed roof repairs and the corrals that needed new posts. Your grandfather built that place, Henderson said. Yes, sir. Good man, your grandfather. Fair dealer, hard worker. Your father was the same. Jake felt his throat tighten. I'm trying to be. Henderson turned around and studied Jake with the same assessing look he gave livestock he was considering purchasing. You've been struggling since Sarah died. Yes, sir. But you're not a quitter. If you were a quitter, you'd have sold out and moved to town weeks ago. Jake didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Henderson sat back down and leaned forward across the table. I'll give you $120,000 for 400 acres, with a 40-year lease at current rates, adjusted for inflation every 5 years. Jake felt his heart sink. It wasn't enough to pay off all his debts and still have money left for repairs and emergencies. Mr. Henderson, I appreciate the offer, but I need at least 140 to make this work. 130? And I pay for all the fence repairs that need to be done in the next 6 months. Jake did quick math in his head. 130,000 would pay off the mortgage and most of his other debts. If Henderson paid for fence repairs, that would save him at least $10,000. That could work, Jake said slowly, and I want first right of refusal if you ever decide to sell the remaining 50 acres, Henderson added. Jake thought about Emma and Ethan, imagining them growing up on 50 acres instead of 500. It wasn't what he'd dreamed of giving them, but it was still a working ranch. It was still their heritage. Deal, Jake said. Henderson reached across the table and shook Jake's hand with the firm grip of someone who'd just made a good business decision. I'll have my lawyer draw up the papers. We can close by the end of the month if you want. Jake drove home in a daze, hardly believing what had just happened. A month ago, he'd been facing bankruptcy and the loss of everything his family had built. Now, he had a path forward that would let him keep the house, pay off his debts, and still raise his children on the land where they belonged. When he walked into his house, he found Maggie in the living room with both babies on a blanket on the floor. Emma and Ethan were lying on their backs, reaching for the colorful toys she'd hung above them. They looked content and alert, like babies who were getting all the attention they needed. How did it go? Maggie asked. Jake sat down on the couch and told her about the conversation with Henderson. As he talked, he felt the weight of the last 6 weeks finally lifting from his shoulders. Not completely, but enough that he could imagine sleeping through the night again. 130,000 plus fence repairs, Maggie said when he finished. That's a good deal, Jake. You should be proud of yourself. I couldn't have done it without you, Jake said. I don't know how to thank you. Maggie was quiet for a moment, watching Emma grab at a dangling toy with the focused determination of someone learning to coordinate her movements. Can I tell you something? Jake nodded. I didn't come here by accident. I heard about your situation and decided to help, but there's more to it than that. Jake felt a chill of concern. What do you mean? 43 years ago, when I said a woman came to help me when my husband died, that woman was Sarah's grandmother. Jake stared at her, not understanding. What? Eleanor Morrison. She was your grandfather's wife, your father's mother. When my first husband died and left me with 3 babies, she showed up at my door with food and supplies and an offer to help. Maggie's voice was soft with memory. I was living in a cabin outside Billings, trying to make it on my own with no family and no money. Eleanor saved our lives. Jake felt like the world had shifted slightly off its axis. Sarah's grandmother helped you? She did more than help. She became like a mother to me. When I remarried a few years later and started my midwife practice, she was the one who encouraged me to specialize in helping families in crisis. She said it was a way to honor the help I'd received by passing it on. Jake thought about his grandmother, who had died when he was 12. He remembered her as a strong, practical woman who always seemed to know what needed to be done in any situation. Eleanor kept in touch with me over the years, Maggie continued. She sent me pictures when your father got married, when you were born, when you married Sarah. She was so proud of her family, so happy that the Morrison Ranch was continuing into another generation. She never mentioned you, Jake said. I asked her not to. My situation back then was complicated. My first husband had some problems that made it dangerous for people to know where I was. Eleanor respected that and kept my secrets. Maggie picked up Ethan, who was starting to fuss. When Eleanor died 8 years ago, I wrote to your father to offer condolences. He wrote back and told me all about you and Sarah, how happy you were, how excited about starting a family. Jake felt tears threaten, something that still happened when people talked about Sarah's excitement about the babies. She wanted children so much. I know. Your father told me. And when word reached me about what happened, about Sarah dying and you being left alone with twins, Maggie's voice trailed off. You came because you felt you owed it to my grandmother. No, Maggie said firmly. I came because Eleanor taught me that family isn't just blood. It's people who show up when you need them most. You and these babies are Eleanor's family, which makes you my family too. Jake looked around his living room, which had been transformed over the past few days from a disaster zone into a home where children could safely grow up. He thought about the deal with Henderson, which would have been impossible to navigate in his previous state of exhaustion and despair. He thought about Emma and Ethan, who were thriving under Maggie's care in a way they hadn't since they were born. What happens now? He asked. Now you sign the papers with Henderson, pay off your debts, and start building the life Sarah would have wanted for these children. Maggie smiled at Ethan, who had grabbed her finger and was trying to put it in his mouth. And I go back to Billings and get back to my regular work. Jake felt panic rise in his chest. You're leaving? Jake, you don't need me anymore. You needed help getting through a crisis, and you've done that. But these babies need their father, not a substitute grandmother. But what if I mess up again? What if I can't handle it on my own? Maggie set Ethan down on the blanket next to Emma and turned to face Jake directly. Look at yourself. 3 days ago, you were convinced you were failing at everything. Today, you negotiated a complex business deal that will secure your family's future. You're feeding the babies on schedule, the house is organized, and you're thinking clearly about long-term solutions instead of just trying to survive day by day. Jake realized she was right. He did feel different, more confident, more capable, more like the person he'd been before Sarah died. The crisis isn't over, Maggie continued. You're still grieving and you're still learning how to be a single parent. But you're not drowning anymore. You're swimming. That evening, after the babies were fed and settled for the night, Jake and Maggie sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the mountains. The November air was cold, but Jake had built a fire in the fireplace and the warmth drifted out through the open door. "Eleanor would be proud of you," Maggie said quietly. "I hope Sarah would be too." "Jake," Maggie said, her voice taking on the gentle firmness she used when she wanted to make sure he really heard something. "Sarah is proud of you. You saved your children's heritage. You found a way to keep them on the land where they belong. You didn't give up when everything seemed impossible." Jake thought about Sarah, about the dreams they'd shared for their family. Raising children on the ranch, teaching them to ride horses, showing them the mountains and streams and meadows that had shaped their parents' lives. Those dreams weren't dead. They were just different now. "Will you come back to visit?" Jake asked. "I'd like Emma and Ethan to know you." Maggie smiled. "Try to keep me away. Eleanor's great-grandchildren are going to know their honorary grandmother whether they like it or not." The next morning, Jake stood in the driveway holding Emma while Maggie loaded her bag into her truck. Ethan was sleeping in his arms, both babies content after their morning feeding. It was the kind of crisp, clear November day that made Montana feel like the most beautiful place on earth. "You sure you'll be all right?" Maggie asked for the third time. "I'll be all right," Jake said, and for the first time in weeks, he actually believed it. Maggie hugged him carefully, mindful of the baby he was holding. "Call me if you need anything. Anything at all." "I will." She climbed into her truck and started the engine. But before she could put it in gear, Jake walked over to her window. "Maggie," he said, "thank you for everything. For showing me that I don't have to do this alone, that asking for help doesn't mean failing." "That's what Eleanor taught me," Maggie said, "and now you can teach it to Emma and Ethan when they're older and facing their own challenges." Jake watched her truck disappear down the road, then looked down at Emma, who was studying his face with serious blue eyes. In the distance, he could see Henderson's crew already working on the fence repairs, and he knew that by the end of the week, his cattle would be back where they belonged. "Well, little girl," he said to Emma, "it's just us again, but that's okay. We're going to be just fine." Emma made a soft cooing sound that might have been agreement, and Jake walked back into the house that finally felt like home again. On the kitchen table, Maggie had left a list of phone numbers: the pediatrician, a reliable babysitter, a lactation consultant, other parents of twins who had volunteered to help if needed. At the bottom of the list, in Maggie's careful handwriting, was a note: "Remember, asking for help is not giving up. It's how families survive." Jake folded the list carefully and put it in his wallet, right next to the picture of Sarah holding the ultrasound image of the twins. Then he sat down in the rocking chair and began telling Emma and Ethan about their mother, about their great-grandmother Eleanor, and about the woman named Maggie, who had shown him that sometimes, when you think you've lost everything, help arrives in the form of a knock on the door that changes everything forever. 6 months later, Jake stood in the same spot where Maggie's truck had been parked, this time watching Henderson's crew finish building a new corral. Emma and Ethan, now sitting up on their own and babbling constantly, were in their high chairs on the porch, watching the construction with the fascination that babies showed for anything involving movement and noise. The ranch was thriving in its new, smaller form. Jake had paid off all his debts, repaired everything that needed fixing, and even had money left in savings for emergencies. More importantly, he had found his rhythm as a single father. The babies were healthy and happy, growing fast and developing distinct personalities that reminded him daily of Sarah. Henderson had turned out to be not just a business partner, but a friend, stopping by regularly to check on Jake and the babies, bringing his wife to cluck over Emma and Ethan like honorary grandparents. Other neighbors had stepped up too, creating a network of support that Jake was no longer too proud to accept. The sound of a familiar truck engine made Jake look up. Maggie's blue pickup was coming up the driveway. and Jake felt the same surge of happiness he'd experienced during her monthly visits over the past 6 months. Emma and Ethan recognized the sound too, both babies turning toward the approaching truck with excited squeals. They had claimed Maggie as family from her first return visit, reaching for her with the same eagerness they showed for Jake. "There's your honorary grandmother," Jake told them, lifting Emma out of her high chair. "Let's go say hello." Maggie climbed out of her truck with a bag of supplies and gifts, as she had on every visit, but this time she also had someone with her, a young woman, probably in her 20s, with the tired, overwhelmed look that Jake remembered from his own darkest days. "Jake," Maggie said, "I'd like you to meet Katie Walsh. She's dealing with a situation similar to what you went through. I thought maybe you could offer some perspective." Jake looked at Katie, seeing his own past struggles reflected in her eyes. He thought about Eleanor's philosophy of passing help forward, about the network of support that had carried his family through their crisis. "Of course," he said, shifting Emma to one arm and extending his hand to Katie. "Come on inside. Let me tell you how a knock on the door can change everything." As they walked toward the house, Emma babbling happily in his arms and Ethan reaching for Maggie from his high chair, Jake realized that Sarah's dream for their family was very much alive. It looked different than they had planned, but it was still here. The children were growing up surrounded by love, on the land that belonged to them, connected to their heritage and their community. And someday, when Emma and Ethan were older and facing challenges of their own, they would remember the lessons learned in these early years. That strength comes not from doing everything alone, but from knowing when to accept help and how to offer it to others. That family extends beyond blood to include anyone willing to show up when you need them most. That sometimes, when your world falls apart, all it takes is someone willing to knock on your door and offer to help you put the pieces back together.